Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on early learning opportunities, specifically around mealtimes. Before we get started, we want to make sure that you are as comfortable as possible before listening in. So if that means that you need to grab something to drink, or maybe a warm blanket or pillow to get a little bit more comfortable, please feel free to do whatever helps you learn best at this time. So again, welcome to Everyday Learning Opportunities. My name is Talene, and I am joined here by my colleague Tammy. We will introduce ourselves in a moment. However, should you have any specific questions around the topic of mealtimes, you are welcome to email us at any time at the addresses listed here. So again, my name is Talene. I am one of the newer members of the Early Choices team, and I'm very, very happy about it. Before joining the Early Choices team, I received my master's from Erickson Institute in Child Development with a specialization in children's law and policy. And even before that, I was a feeding and play therapist at a pediatric clinic in the northern suburbs of Chicago, where I did mostly group and individual sessions for children with delays, disabilities, and various sensory challenges, especially around feeding. However, even though I have a lot of experience in the field, being aunt to my 2.5-year-old niece, Emma, has definitely informed the way I think about all topics related to child development. And so that has shifted my perspective a little bit. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Tammy, to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tammy Roble. I am a parent to two young adults who are exceptionally abled. I have a daughter who is 20 and a son who is 22. Been married for over 23 years now. One interesting fact about me is that I love animals, as I watch my cat walk across the room right now. I am an inclusion specialist with Early Choices. I'm also a developmental therapist in the state of Illinois through the Early Intervention Program, and I'm a certified infant massage instructor. So we hope that you enjoy this webinar and take some good information and some helpful hints. So we have three big ideas that we want to cover. The first one is child development and how different domains of a child's development impact mealtime. Then we're going to really dive into mealtime, talking specifically about some challenges that may exist and some opportunities. And then we want to provide some helpful hints for you.
Just as a heads up too, we are going to turn off our cameras so that you can see the slides as best as possible. So before we get into our major ideas for today, one of the things that we want to mention is that we're working with the underlying understanding that all families are rooted within a culture. Oftentimes, when we think about culture within mealtimes, we think about the types of food we eat, maybe the native language we speak while we're eating, use of utensils. But what we're also talking about is the styles of your mealtimes. So you'll see from the images here that maybe sometimes children are eating in front of the television. Maybe sometimes they are a part of the prep before a mealtime. And then maybe other times a child is in the middle of play and taking some bites as they go. So we know that you are the expert on your child and your family. And while we may share some hints or approaches that may be helpful, you are welcome to alter them or tweak them in whatever way works best for your family and their culture.
So meal times are definitely more than just food. When we think about child development, we think about 5 main domains. First one is social development. So around mealtime, a lot of that social development can be influenced and encouraged. not just back and forth communication, but being aware that there are other people in the room, and then learning how to interact with other people during meal times. We also think about another main domain of development being adaptive skills. Those are all those self-help skills. So eating, sleeping, drinking, and you notice that eating was the first one that I mentioned. A lot of what we do with our bodies during mealtime is wrapped up in that motor area. And we use our small muscles and our larger muscles to be able to maintain our bodies in ways and use our bodies in ways to be able to eat effectively. The communication piece is also influenced at mealtime. I mentioned that briefly when I talked about social development. We listen to other people during mealtime. We imitate other people during mealtime. We express ourselves during mealtime, whether that's using gestures or sounds or words. And then finally, that last one, cognition. We do a lot of problem solving and exploration. Cause and effect relationships come into play during mealtime. And so we're going to take a look at these next slides and think about how all these different areas of development come into play during mealtimes. All right, so motor development and cognitive development are big parts of meal times. We included the link to Infant and Toddler Forum at the bottom of this slide. This site breaks down different milestones that occur that affect mealtime. Those milestones are in motor development, cognitive development. They're also in that social and that personal social domain. They're also in that adaptive domain. And motor development includes that fine motor and that gross motor. So check out this site for more information about different milestones. Meal times are definitely an opportunity to build healthy habits. We know that foods need to be introduced 10 to 15 times before a child will accept it. So, wow, that's a lot, right? 10 to 15 times. Don't expect, if you're struggling with your child, being willing to try new foods or take a bite out of something or even touch something, for that to happen immediately. A lot of times it takes kids several times to be able to feel comfortable before they're willing to explore those foods. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But meal times are definitely an opportunity to introduce and encourage new foods. It's an opportunity for families to bond and a time to introduce those cultural norms. And those are all of those, like Talene was saying earlier, all of those specific things about your family that make you unique. Mealtimes are a time to encourage families to model healthy eating. Your child is very aware of what you are doing, and they are going to imitate you. Mealtimes are also a time to provide opportunities to talk about nutrition, foods that might be better for your body than others, and then also portion sizes.
So as Tammy mentioned, oftentimes children are going to imitate you. They can be very aware of what you're doing and how you are interacting with a certain environment. And so we really want to highlight the fact that if you as the caregiver are calm, it can help the child also either calm down or feel calm before or during a mealtime. So some of the ways we can think about strategies that can help is using calming music to set the tone. So maybe there is a song that can help a child transition to a mealtime. Maybe there is a song that you created together that can help them feel a little bit calmer in their bodies and get them ready to eat. But that's one great strategy that we like to use for children, really across all settings, but especially during meal times. You can also try using cushions or soft pillows for children to sit on if they are sitting on a chair at the table. If they are a child who can be a little bit wiggly at times, this can provide some support to them so that they can continue to move but stay stable on that chair so that they don't have to keep getting up from the table. You can also use lap pads or blankets while seated to provide deep pressure. Oftentimes, weighted blankets have a lot of benefits for children and sometimes adults. So that's another option as well. And then the other option is the idea of blowing bubbles is really beneficial, not only because it's super fun and it helps children calm down because they're focusing on an activity that they may enjoy, but blowing bubbles is also a great opportunity for warming up the muscles we use for eating. So when you're practicing blowing bubbles, you're using your cheeks, you're getting some awareness around your lips, maybe your tongue and your teeth as well. And so that's a great option for calming down right before a mealtime and then in turn preparing them for the mealtime as well. And then while you're actually eating, chewing foods can be calming as well. I know personally for myself, chewing foods is very, very calming. And then finally, we have just the reminder that sometimes all we really need is to take a deep breath. And this can be a little bit harder to model for children, especially if they're a lot younger, because if you just tell them to take a deep breath, that connection may not necessarily always be there, especially if they're upset. So we like to use the analogy of smelling the flower and blowing the pinwheel. When you smell the flower, you're taking in a big inhale. And when you're blowing the pinwheel, you are exhaling all that air out. Something I like to do with my niece is to draw a picture of a flower on one side of a piece of paper and a pinwheel on another, so that we sort of have a physical tool to go along with this as well. So a lot of options here in terms of calming. Now, oftentimes when we think about eating, we think about it as a two-step process. So you sit down at the table and you start eating, right? But when we think about the approach that we want to use with children, especially those who may struggle with certain foods or textures or smells, the reality of it, and this is adapted from a therapeutic approach to feeding that's called the SOS approach, SOS standing for sequential oral sensory approach to feeding. And so we don't necessarily need to worry about that acronym, but what this does highlight is the fact that there are many, many steps, around 32, to actually getting to eat. And this is because we need to take the opportunity to explore foods in all kinds of different ways that affect our senses before we actually get to eating. So if we look at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that this is where we're starting because we're starting with tolerating the food. So can the child handle being at the table with the food? Can they be in the same room as the food? Can they look at it? Can they tolerate it on their plate? This is the very beginning of the process of a child's relationship with food before we can even consider them eating it. From there, we move on to interacts with. So maybe they can assist in the preparation, like we saw in that photo in the beginning. Maybe they can use utensils to explore pouring or stirring with this ingredient or food. Whatever it might be, it's just that very preliminary experience of being able to look at and in some way or another get ready to possibly touch that food. From there, we move on to smell. So of course, foods have varying degrees of smells. And so can the child handle that odor at the table or in the room? And then can they even lean down and pick it up to smell an item? So this is another way that we're going through the senses to think about how comfortable a child might be with a certain food item. From there, we move to touch. And when we think about touch, we think about it as a trajectory from the fingertips all the way up the arm to the neck, and then ultimately to our faces because our mouths are on our faces. And so, can your child handle touching the food with one finger? Can they maybe touch it to their nose? and then to their lips, because ultimately, right, our goal is to make it into our mouths. And then from there, we get to taste. And while it may not sound too appetizing, taste doesn't always necessarily mean swallowing the foods. So it may involve licking a food item or biting it and trying it and then spitting it out. But ultimately, we know that if they've gotten to that point with the food, they've made a lot of progress and taken many steps to get them ready to eat that food. The other reason that we want to share this simplified version of the SOS approach to feeding is that we really want to make sure that you don't feel discouraged if your child isn't immediately sitting down and eating a new food. As Tammy mentioned, it takes at least 10 to 15 times of a child trying a food in order to maybe getting to the point of knowing whether or not they like it or feel comfortable with it. And then all of these steps have to be achieved as well before they get to that point. And because this session is called Everyday Learning Opportunities, taking these steps with your children can create an opportunity to discover and explore foods together, which can help them build vocabulary, gives you the opportunity to have conversations with new words that describe the way maybe foods feel or smell, what color they are, what shape they are, all kinds of details that can make it a really fun experience. And then again, because you're breaking it down, this also makes for a fun interaction with you as a caregiver and can also speak to the social emotional piece of development.
So we have some mealtime helpful hints for you. The first one we want to mention is the scheduled time to eat, whether that's dinner, snack times, breakfast. So children like to know what is going to happen next. So they have helps them have some control over their day and those expectations. So encouraging them to understand through use of a schedule when they're going to be expected to eat is really helpful, especially for children where eating is not an enjoyable experience. It's extremely important to give lots of praise to children, especially those children that are struggling with eating during mealtime. We encourage you to point out everything that's positive, even those little steps. Please do not cause attention or comment on anything that's not working. Please don't force them to clear their plates. This is also really important for children that are struggling with eating. We have to think about what's that next step in the progression of their enjoyment of food. And sometimes, many times, that's going to be that they're not yet clearing their plate. We also have to remember that kids aren't necessarily born with understanding and being able to regulate their digestive systems. And so sometimes we have to help them with that. Another suggestion is to have one thing on that plate that they really enjoy, at least one item. Choices can also come into play during meal times, giving them a choice between two different food items or giving them a choice between where they want to sit. If you like to have meals at the dining room table, you can offer them a choice between two different chairs. You can offer a choice between which utensils they want to use, which plates they want to use. This leads us to that next helpful hint. Using visuals to include on placemats is helpful for kiddos. It makes it a little more fun for them. Encouraging characters that they really enjoy listening to or watching, things that they're familiar with. This could also include bringing items that are safe to the table with them or wherever that is where you as a family eat. So if they have a blanket that they like to carry around with them that makes them feel safe and secure, let them bring that with them to the table. Modeling good eating habits is very important because your children are watching you and listening to you all of the time. So if you try something, they're going to be more willing to try something. Again, we want to think back to what Talene was sharing with the SOS approach. We don't want to force them to do any of that. But if you're modeling that, it's going to make it a bit easier for them and they're going to feel more safe. We also suggest not discussing eating habits during mealtimes, especially if your child is struggling with mealtime. Save that for a time when they're not in the room. Instead, talk about some of those things that Talene just mentioned. Talk about the color of the food, the shapes of the food, the size of the food. Talk about how the food feels. What's it smell like? You can also get into early quantity concepts during mealtime. Give me one, put some of them here and some of them there. Give me all of them. Let's count to 5. Count 5 carrots, or give me 2. We have a few more helpful hints for you. It's nice to include children as part of the setup, whether it's preparing the food or preparing the place where you eat. It might be getting some plates out, getting some cups out, pouring the liquid, scooping out the food. I mentioned earlier exploring details about the food, having guessing games where maybe you take a napkin and you cover up the dish and you can go around and guess what's on the dish. Making faces, singing songs, making mealtime fun. Another suggestion we have that you may have heard of trying in different situations during a child's day is social stories. And basically what a social story is, it's a way to help a child know what to expect step by step of an event or an activity. And so if you think of like making a book, you wouldn't necessarily have to do it that way. You could also just take pictures of each individual steps that lead up to mealtime, or lead up to actually putting that food in their mouth. But that's a great way to help a child prepare for that event. And you can find more about social stories by looking that up online. And then again, we're going to come back to this 10 to 15 times. You have to try, and try again. This isn't always an easy task, and we have to make it as enjoyable as possible without putting extra stress on that child and without putting extra stress on you.
So oftentimes there are also opportunities to think about meal times outside of actual meal times. And the ways that we can think about doing this is through games and activities that help children build strengths that can relate to eating, but they don't really know that that's what's happening at that time, right? They're just having fun. So some of the ways that you can do this is through activities that involve scooping and pouring with different utensils, and that doesn't always necessarily have to be with food. Maybe they pour water in the bathtub. Maybe they're scooping sand, right? But the idea is that they're getting used to the motion of using a utensil to scoop up an item or to pour it. And then that gives a better understanding of how much weight they have in their hand, how much control they have for their fine and gross motor skills, right? With their hands and their arms as well. And so these are great ways for them to make connections in terms of muscle movement, but doesn't exactly relate to meal times. Other games or activities that are options for children is putting small objects through holes into containers, playing with Play-Doh, scooping, stabbing, cutting, and pinching pieces. So again, we're getting some nice practice with those fine motor skills that can be applicable to meal times. Other options for games or activities include pretending to feed a baby doll. This is a really nice way to also frame conversations about food with children. So maybe you're talking about how the baby feels hungry. Maybe you're talking about how the baby feels full. Maybe there's a preferred food that the baby has and another food that they don't really like so much. And so we're going to practice with that baby so that baby can explore the food. Maybe you can even go through some of the steps that we mentioned with the baby doll in exploring food. Another option too is to have imaginary tea parties, picnics, or meals, because that may take some of the pressure away from actually eating, but gets back to the real connection that can be made between caregiver and child during a mealtime. So there's a lot of different ways that you can incorporate meal times without it seeming so obvious. So we've talked about this before, and we actually adapted this from a piece on transitions, but we find it to be very applicable for all learning opportunities for children. So the idea is that we just want you to eat your peas, right? Is that too much to ask? And so some of the tips that you can use in order to help you and help your child are these overarching ideas. So being consistent, like we've said many times now, 10 to 15 tries is really the way for a child to get a better understanding of a certain food item. And so, while it may feel challenging to continue to introduce it or to continue to feel that resistance from a child, that consistency of reintroducing it often is going to be really key for the child. Slowing down. So, again, we talked about those calming techniques, but also just taking a little bit of time to explore with your child during meal times can also be very beneficial. Involving your child. So this can be in having them help with the prep, but it can also include giving them some choices when it comes to what's happening during mealtime. So maybe you're letting them decide which food items can be on their plate. Maybe they're making choices in terms of what order they eat their foods, right? The name of the game is pretty much control. And so anytime your child feels like they have control over what's happening, it's going to feel a lot better for them and for you as well. And giving cues and warning before change pretty much go hand in hand, because the idea is that you want to give them some sort of heads up when a mealtime is coming. Maybe you're letting them know in the previous activity that they have 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left, 1 minute left before it's going to be time to wash hands and sit down to eat. And similarly, you want to warn them before change, let's say if the mealtime is going to come to an end soon. So we will also share these resources with you on our page, but these are available to you if you'd like to explore a little bit further through some of the stuff that we've discussed today. And should you have any interest in exploring some of the other topics that we share, we do post often on our Instagram, our Facebook, and our Twitter pages. And so our handle is listed here if you'd like to follow along with us.
Our next session is going to be on Thursday, December the 10th, and we're going to be talking about everyday learning opportunities during play. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.